Hello and welcome to the SANS APAC webcast series, Geolocation Forensics. My name is Ruby Souza and I will be moderating the webcast today. Your presenter is Chad Tilbury. Before I turn the mic over to him, I would like to cover features of the interface for those who have not attended a SANS webcast before. This screen is split up into three main regions: the participants list, the chat window, and the whiteboard, which has already been loaded. The list of names you see in the participants list are your fellow attendees, moderators, and the presenter, who is also a moderator. To send a message, point your cursor at the entry box below the main window. Please note that moderators and the presenter will see all messages, both public and private. As mentioned, the whiteboard already has the slides loaded. The presenter will advance the slides as he moves through the material, and it will advance automatically. Note that the software may buffer speech, so if you experience network delays, playback will speed up, causing a chipmunk effect. If you experience technical difficulties during the webcast, please send an email to webcast-support@sans.org or notify a moderator. Thank you for your attention. Now let me turn the mic over to your presenter, Chad Tilbury.
Hey everybody, how are you? I would say good evening, but I'm assuming for all of you it's probably more like good morning, but we're getting probably edging close to the afternoon. So that's why we timed it this way, so we could actually spend some time with you on your own schedule. The first thing I'd say is if you have any questions, just put them into that chat window, because I'll be paying attention to that as we go through, so that's probably the best place to get my attention. Don't worry about raising your hand or anything like that. I'll just be paying attention to whatever you type in there and kind of working that in to the conversation. Any America's Cup sailing fans out there? I got to be honest, I almost didn't make this. I had a distinct urge today to actually get on a plane to San Francisco to see the final tomorrow. It has been incredibly exciting. Given that we're talking with a bunch of Aussies, hopefully a few of you are watching it. The American boat is essentially the Australian boat. The skipper is an Aussie, and the Americans have come back from an 8-to-1 kind of trailing piece there, and now it is 8-8 with the next race being the one that will finish it off. So it's essentially Aussies versus Kiwis. You're not looking at it. All of them are on YouTube. So what are you doing here? Get off this webcast and move on to, no, I'm kidding. Anyway, I recommend it. It's been incredibly exciting. Okay, well, let's talk about some geolocation forensics. This has been something I've been really interested in for a while, and I'm assuming a lot of you are too, since you're here tonight. It was really, at least my interest was engendered by this specific case here. This is the Vincent Brothers case. Vincent Brother was convicted of killing his wife, 3 children, and his mother-in-law. And that's not really the interesting part. Once I knew his mother-in-law was involved, I knew for a fact that he had done it, right? But the really interesting part about Vincent Brothers was that the way that the evidence was laid against him. So Vincent Brothers was in Ohio, and I threw up a graph up here for those of you that aren't incredibly well-versed in U.S. geography. But you'll notice that Google Maps view right in the middle of this slide. So Vincent Brothers' family went to California, Northern California, in order to go on vacation. He apparently rented a car in Ohio, drove it to California, killed his 5 family members, and then drove back, turned the car in, and used that as his alibi. And that's the idea that I was in Ohio the entire time. Now the investigators did something clever when this happened. That they actually sourced all of the rental car companies around the area, found one that actually had 4,500 unexplained miles on it. Not the kind of miles you put on a car during a weekend trip. They impounded it, of course, and as you see here on the right, they pulled the radiator out of the car. And what they did is they actually hired a forensic entomologist from the University of California, Davis. And this is obviously an expert in bugs. And this person went through that radiator and started picking out the bugs off the radiator, and started geolocating the car based on what bugs actually had been killed on the car itself. So they found things like the leg of a grasshopper that's only found east of Texas. They found specific true bugs from Utah, Arizona, and then into California. And then they found a wasp, a paper wasp, that only existed actually in California. So they were able to find a breadcrumb trail just based on kind of geolocating where these bugs were from. And it kind of got me thinking. It was this idea of, wow, if they can do that using bugs, what can we do via forensic artifacts? You know, certainly GPS units are getting more prevalent. So in these day and age, we might have been able to pull the GPS directly out of the car and do this. But GPS units aren't yet in a lot of our mobile devices, particularly things like laptops. So what I want to figure out is, how would we do this via kind of a mobile device? You know, in the absence of something like GPS, what are all the other artifacts that we have available to us to kind of make some determinations on where a device has actually been? And then if the device has been someplace, we can make some assumptions that the person that owns the device was also there. So this is a study that actually is almost 2 years old now, but it kind of gives us an idea of just how many smartphone owners are actually using geolocation artifacts. We kind of see down here that almost 60% back in 2011 were actually had used some sort of geolocation. One of the nice things about this is usually once a user turns it on, they don't typically turn it back off. So if they use it once, probably that device is going to be recording artifacts related to the geolocation of where it's at. And that's, of course, what we can take advantage of. Not to mention all these applications like, I don't know if anyone actually recognizes this, but that's actually the mayor badge from Foursquare. And it's all these kind of applications now that reward people for checking in, reward people for actually showing where they're at, whether it's Twitter, where you can put your location right into a tweet, or it's applications like Foursquare, where you can actually get extra points for checking into places the most frequent of other people. But undeniably, the trend of geolocation artifacts is only increasing. You know, you look at some of these pictures, and this is actually from Eric Fisher. He put some of these up on Flickr. And these are the red dots are Flickr, the blue dots are Twitter, and the white is both. And you get an idea of just how prevalent, even into Africa, we're starting to see kind of a wealth of kind of geotag posts going on. And of course, here's North America, where we see just about in every populated area of the country, there's a massive amount of these artifacts. So we shouldn't be surprised if we find not one or two geolocation artifacts on a system, but really in some cases hundreds, thousands, able to geolocate it almost down to the minute of where a device has actually been. So what we'll start out with is actually one of the easier pieces, something called exif data. And this is another case study which was kind of interesting. I don't know if this actually made it across the ocean to all of you, but this was a pretty famous case in the U.S. out of Florida. Casey Anthony she was a young single mom. She had a beautiful 3-year-old daughter who apparently got kidnapped. The only rub in the story was that Casey Anthony waited over 30 days to actually notify law enforcement that her daughter was missing, and only really did so once her family basically forced her to do it. As the case rolled along, we found some other things. Her trunk smelled of decay. Her daughter was found just steps really away from her family's home out in the field. Some interesting digital evidence came off the computers, like how to make chloroform and things like that. But more than all of that, what really struck me during this case was actually this picture. And this is actually Casey Anthony at a club. And this is one of those clubs where you have a photographer that comes to the club and actually takes pictures of all the patrons. And the idea, I think, is that, you know, if you can't remember how much fun you had the next day, well, you can go up and check it out when you're done, maybe buy a photo or whatever. But this was a professional photographer. They put their picture up on Flickr. And those of you that are Flickr users might know that Flickr maintains all of the picture metadata when photos are uploaded, unless you have like a pro account, and then you have some options on whether you want to include that or not. Well, a journalist stumbled upon this picture looking through and said, man, that looks a lot like Casey Anthony. Grabbed the picture, pulled the information out of the picture, so we call it the exif data, and actually was able to actually determine the date and time that the picture was taken. And this picture was taken 2 weeks after her daughter had gone missing. And the minute I saw this picture, I realized there was no doubt in my mind that Casey Anthony had to be guilty. There's no way that a mom could actually have her daughter missing for over 2 weeks and still be able to go out to a club and have a smile like that. There were some interesting parts about the case. There was some evidence that was not allowed in because it would be too prejudicial to the jury. I don't know if this picture was part of that, but I might guess that it was, actually. And as a postscript, believe it or not, she actually got acquitted And it's a long story, but probably some of that is due to forensic evidence and then some of the analyzing of that. So anyway, if you're interested, look the case up. It was a fabulous case. Lots of great testimony going on in the digital forensics world as well. So this exit data. Now, I'm guessing, how many of you have actually heard of exit data? I think the word is out, right? That exit data is in play. I think what is not out as much is just how much data you can actually pull out. I mean, things like the actual embedded timestamps, which were useful in the Casey Anthony case. Things like the exact make and model and serial number of the actual camera. Things like the camera orientation is sometimes interesting. I've heard of some cases which have been solved just based on knowing kind of which way the camera was held in some cases. You can even determine things like cropped photos by looking at embedded kind of thumbnails as well as some of the software that might have been used to kind of modify those photos. But of course, for our purposes in this case, really, the keys to the kingdom and exit data are going to be this lat and long. One of the wonderful things about it is even if the device that took the picture doesn't have a GPS unit in it, there's still a chance that you can actually still pull lat and long based on other sort of geolocation kind of devices within it or applications. And we'll see a little example of that coming up. So it doesn't, not only GPS in these cases, things like Wi-Fi networks are also used for this. There's been a couple, I mean there's been a lot of fun things going on about this. The SANS Internet Storm Center did a study a while back where they went and just grabbed a bunch of images and then started geolocating them. Looks like Australia didn't do too badly. We got just one or two from Australia and New Zealand. We got quite a bit more in places like Japan, it looks like, Southeast Asia. You're doing pretty well. You can tell the U.S. isn't paying attention to this idea. The thing I love about this, in addition to finding all of this exit data just in these pictures that people have uploaded, that in many cases they could tie it not only to the location, but also the name of the person. And you think about this from a security perspective, more than just digital forensics. Sadly, there's a lot of people that are unaware of this. They're posting pictures up, the exit data is maintained, and you have things like stalkers or maybe predators or things like that. Imagine taking pictures of your kids. Someone takes a liking to them, starts to pull the geolocation data out of here, and shows up at your front door, or starts stalking your children. So lots of scary things going on in the geolocation world. People have been trying to really warn people of this. This is one of my favorite sites, ICanStalkYou.com. It was actually put together by Jackson and Pesci from Paul.com. They've had a long storied battle with this site. I think it's offline for good now, but they've had a big battle with Twitter. Go up, go down. Twitter kept changing some of their APIs in terms of service and things like that. But it just cracks me up. I mean, is there anything kind of more scary than finding yourself on the site? Funnily enough, this wasn't the first of the sites to do this. I don't know if anyone heard of ICanRobYou.com. And oh no, it was called PleaseRobMe.com. Even better. And that site actually did get shut down by Twitter and never popped up. But it would literally pull up pictures to geolocate where your house was and then correlate those with any time you said you were outside of that general area and post a Please Rob Me post. So bottom line is not a bad idea from the standpoint of getting user awareness. There's just a lot of people out there that still don't realize that this is available. There's a fair number of tools out there that will pull this out, but I think the one that's far and away the best was written by a guy named Phil Harvey. It's called Exif Tool. It's a free command line based tool. Not only it pulls information out of images, it actually does well over 100 different file formats. It's an incredible force of nature. How someone can create something like this is actually beyond my comprehension. I mean, to actually be able to pull out metadata from just about every video format, every image format, things like Word documents, both the old and the new versions of Word documents, PDFs, portable executable formats, pulling things like the compile time to actually determine when a piece of malware was created. All this can be easily pulled out of Exif Tool. If you haven't used it, put it in your toolkit. I put it right on my desktop so I can nicely drop anything onto that I have an interest in. Which is actually how I came upon this picture. I actually got this picture while I was teaching a SANS class. It was from Rob Lee, who's the curriculum lead at SANS for forensics. And I was up in Canada teaching it. It was a little bit cold, and the photo basically said, "Wish you were here," and Rob was out on vacation. And so I remember telling the students, "Hey, let's check this out. We just went over ExifTool. Let's see if we have any geolocation information in this picture." And so I just grabbed the picture, dropped it on ExifTool right on my desktop, and got this information back. As you can see, I've highlighted some pieces of interest, but there's a lot of data out of here. In fact, there was more than can even fit on this screen. I pulled a few pieces out. Not only was this an Apple iPhone, it actually tells me which camera actually took the picture. In this case, it was the back camera. And what we're seeing here are kind of the embedded timestamps. So these actually follow that picture along. Even if they've been copied in multiple volumes or uploaded to a server, whatever that is, we have an embedded kind of creation date and modification date for that image, which can be quite interesting. And then finally, of course, the item that we really are all here for, which is the idea of this relatively, or in some cases, extremely accurate GPS coordinates. And we'll talk about why those are so accurate. In some cases, phones actually have better accuracy than actually GPS units in some cases. So I, of course, took those coordinates, I threw them into Google Maps, and was able to get a very close idea of where Rob was staying. And then I, of course, went even further. If you look at this, I can almost see the beach chair where Rob was sitting when he was watching the kind of sunset. It kind of matched up with that original photo. The fact that stuff like this is at our fingertips for free, that any one of us can pull up satellite imagery and geolocate where a picture or a device was, if you would have told someone even 10 years ago that was going to be possible, I think they probably wouldn't have believed you. Pretty astonishing, actually. But that's the basics. So you guys have probably mostly heard of ExifTool, I'm assuming. Let's dig a little deeper. And so one of the things that's been around for a long time is the ability to geolocate IP addresses. And again, this is something that I'm guessing most of you are familiar with. But bear with me here, because this is going to be just one of many artifacts that we're going to piece together, which is really going to allow us to have some very, very fine accuracy of where a device might be. This is just a start. So certainly if I have an IP address, with some degree of accuracy, I can geolocate about where that device is. Okay? So we can pull that out. Now, we largely live in a DHCP world, which is actually a really good thing for us from a geolocation standpoint. So we prefer this because the faster that IPs rotate, the more data points we have. So the more somebody's rolling around, either within their own environment or maybe across different environments, the more kind of IP addresses I might have to kind of follow them. The only disappointing part is that DHCP is not necessarily easy to come by from host-based artifacts, especially in the Windows world. There just aren't a lot. There's no such thing as like a DHCP log on a Windows workstation, for instance. So we got to kind of scrabble around to kind of find this information. One of the first places I often go is actually the registry key we're looking at here. So it's in the system hive. It has an entry for each of the network interfaces that device has. Now, whatever devices have been used to get on a network will often have information related to the last network they connected to. And so, for instance, we can see things like, first of all, when this device was connected. So we have a last write time for all these registry keys. So for this interface, which is, if I remember correct, was the Ethernet kind of interface for this device, it had a DHCP IP address that we're looking at here at a very specific date and time. So I might be able to kind of geolocate that. And at this date and time, this device was around this general area, maybe in the city or something like this. So it's a starting place. It's not going to win my case for me likely, but it'll get me closer, right? Not to mention the fact you look like things like this. Look at that DHCP domain. I don't even need to geolocate that because I can actually get some information out there. Now that might look a little different to all of you, but that Comcast is a very popular cable provider in the US. And it often puts or prefaces its domain with the name of the state that actually it's sitting in. And so that UT you see on that line is actually Utah. So I can tell with some degree of accuracy that device was in Utah at 10/7/2010 at 22:36 in this case. So where can we get those IP addresses? And that was one of the things I was really kind of trying to dig into. If one IP address is great, but what if I could get a lot more? And that's when I started thinking about, well, where else are these IP addresses recorded? And the Windows firewall log, believe it or not, or firewall logs in general, for any OS, can be a really rich source of finding all of the IP addresses that device has been actually assigned. Because they often have the actual incoming or the outgoing kind of address. So you see kind of both sides of the connection. And so what I've got highlighted here, of course, is the IP address of the actual system I was looking at. The other IP addresses are the ones that we're trying to connect in. So even if you have firewall logs that only are recording denies, for instance, which is relatively common, even in that case, there are so many. The minute you put a device up online, you all know this, it starts getting pinged almost immediately. It's almost like the internet's alive. You just have these constant connections kind of barraging your system. Well, each one of those is leaving an entry in that firewall log, and each entry will actually have the IP address of whatever the computer was assigned at that time. So I can kind of use this almost as a historical reference of all the IP addresses that's been. You know, looking back at that Vincent Brothers case, imagine that he had a laptop, and imagine that he was jumping into, let's say, different McDonald's or different kind of wireless access points as he's going across the country. There's a decent chance that those IP addresses would have been recorded and possibly be able to be used in order to tell state by state by state that he was actually going to. Now, it's not just Windows, of course. Every operating system these days is going to have firewall logs. Now, Mac and Unix, as you might imagine, are going to have much better logs in general. So we'll be able to pull out things like the firewall logs or the daily logs or things like that in order to get very, very similar kind of information as we see in those Windows logs. In fact, that daily log is one of my favorites. So it's on Mac OS X, BSD in general, and some other flavors of kind of Linux or Unix. So if you ever see daily.out, for instance, it's a fantastic reference. It gets, as you might imagine, it's a daily log, so it tells me each day kind of what the IP address that system was on. So at a minimum, I can start to geolocate day by day in here. So as we see here, here's our wonderful IP address again sitting out here in the daily log. So that's in var log daily out, if those of you that are sitting on a Mac system tonight. Something else I've kind of used in cases before are broadband logs. This is an idea of mobile broadband, kind of a chip or something that might be in a laptop. And in many cases, to be honest, the IP addresses that we're getting here, like we see in this is actually for, I believe, a Sprint broadband card. Those of you that are familiar with Sprint, it's one of the big providers in the US. But we see an IP address there, and to be honest, the IP addresses typically are not very useful. At least in my experience, for doing geolocation. They tend to not be really located in areas or in the databases like you'll see a lot of other IP addresses out there. So I haven't had a lot of luck with that, but what I have had luck with is kind of looking at the timestamps. For instance, you see here we have a Zulu time or a UTC time on here. Now the nice thing about broadband is it's going over the cell networks. So the cell networks tend to be highly reliable related to things like their time stamps. This idea is I don't have to worry about the user updating their time zone or things like that on the computer because that actually gets automatically updated by the cell towers. You've seen this on your own cell phones. So at a minimum, this gives me a pretty decent timestamp of the user that I can trust. And the other thing I've seen in some of these logs, and we see it here, you notice how the timestamp at the bottom is actually in UTC time. The one at the top is actually in local time. So at a minimum, I can cross-reference those. And in this case, it looks like they're about, what is that, 4 hours apart, it looks like, in this case. I convert the other one to military time. That is almost certainly, at that date and time, part of the Eastern Standard Time in the U.S. So while I can't geolocate this maybe to a specific city or specific location, I can at a minimum say this device was in Eastern Time at that specific time. Okay. Now that again would have been enough for the Vincent Brothers case, right? I don't have to prove every single city he's been in. I just have to prove that his laptop was actually in California at the time of the murder. If I can do that, that's a huge win. And that could have actually been done through these things like mobile broadband logs. So while not the most useful in some cases, Don't ignore them, because they could actually be that one artifact that actually solves that case for you. But we can do better than that. IP addresses are pretty old school. Luckily, Windows just keeps creating new artifacts for us. Those of you that have been in forensics for a while, pay your dues to Windows. Keep sending in that money for Windows 8.1 or Windows 9 or whatever's coming in, because we keep getting really big presents wrapped up in a bow in all of these. And starting with Windows 7, we actually got something called network location awareness. We'll actually see this in practice in a moment in this registry key. Now, what network location awareness does is it actually tracks what networks your system has been on. And this is largely for things like the firewall. And you've seen this undoubtedly if you're running Windows 7, where you'll connect to a network and it'll ask you things like, is this a public network? Is this a home network? Is this your work network? What it's doing is it's creating a profile, so it knows the next time you connect to that network, what parameters to apply to that network. So the idea is that you can have more restrictive kind of settings within your firewall and other security software if you're on a public network versus when you're in your home. Maybe you want to allow things like sharing to go outside of your system when you're at home, but you definitely don't want to do it when you're at Starbucks. Now, the good thing for us is that it's creating this historical record of all of the networks that that system is actually connected to. Now, just a quick view of these gives us a decent idea about maybe where the system has been. Here's that Utah Comcast again. So I know that at some point this system had been at Utah Comcast. I see capitalcollege.edu. That's actually out in Maryland on the east coast of the U.S. I see someone's been on corporate.mandiant site. Well, Mandiant's a relatively small company with a small number of offices, so we might be able to figure out kind of where or which office that was, maybe based on the IP address or things like that. Or one of my favorites is right here. If you haven't figured out, I'm actually based out of Utah, and so you can see my system actually out on the Salt Lake City airport Wi-Fi. It doesn't get any better than that, except it looks like they spelled airport wrong, and it's the first time I've noticed that as I kind of stare at this a little bit. But at a minimum, remember these are registry keys, so I have a last write time for each one of those. So I know the last time that device was at the Salt Lake City airport, the last time it was on the Mandiant network, the last time it connected to that Comcast cable network. So that gives us some things. Also, for each one of those, we can even get deeper and identify things like which adapter. So I can figure out, was that my Ethernet adapter or was it via wireless? And even the MAC address of the access point that was connected to. So now we're starting to get some interesting things here. So that's the network location awareness key. Now this key has actually been around since Windows XP, and we kind of forget, how painful things used to be before XP. This idea of kind of having a wireless manager was a pretty big feature. It used to be kind of a nightmare to get onto a variety of different wireless networks, and so wireless zero configuration essentially remembers all the wireless networks you've been on, and when you're in range of them again, does the wonderful benefit of trying to reconnect to them. So we'll be using this, of course, to track those wireless networks. So now, wherever that device is connected to, I should expect to see an entry for that. And here's where we're going to find it. So you see the registry keys here on the bottom. Now we actually get a fair amount more information than actually that network location awareness. So in addition, again, to having kind of a date and time of when this was last connected to, I get things like the SSID of the device and descriptor information. So now I'm kind of looking at not only a network, this is not only a Hyatt network, it looks like it's the Hyatt Vancouver. And I even get another bit of information about which wireless access point it was. Hyatt Vancouver 2, whatever that was. If it were a really important case, it was a murder case, I'd send an agent up to the Hyatt Vancouver and have them walk around the building and figure out where Hyatt Vancouver 2 is. Now I'm not only getting it to Vancouver, getting it to a specific building, and maybe even inside of that building where we're likely to have this device. And again, I have a timestamp associated with that. So now we're getting somewhere. And we can also take this, by the way, and we can cross-reference it with other registry keys. For instance, this kind of key right here, the name of it, is actually our profile. We can cross-reference that profile through the registry and get additional things. Like we can actually find the first time that wireless was connected to. So we can actually get 2 different timestamps for this type of artifact. So I'm not seeing many questions from you. Assuming some of you are furiously scribbling notes, I hope. I hope that some of this has been a little new to you. Or maybe we have some veterans that have been doing this for a while. But definitely hit me up in the chat room if you have any questions. Don't be shy. But wireless zero configuration was actually replaced in Windows 7 with something called WLAN for whatever reason. And we get even a bigger benefit in Windows 7. So now, actually, instead of having to go to the registry, where those keys actually still are, but if you don't want to go to the registry, I can go simply to the event logs. And by default, there will be a new event log there called WLAN autoconfig. That log will not only now tell me what networks a device is connected to, it actually tells me an historical record. It keeps an entry for every single network at every single time that that device has been connected to. So now I can get kind of historical record of each individual device. And we can actually see kind of the date and time, of course. And again, the SSID looks like this was a Hilton Honors. Okay, so now I know it was a Hilton, essentially. And MAC address of the actual access point again. Now this kind of reminds me of another case. There was a case, a really famous case in the US that I believe it either went to the state or maybe the actual federal Supreme Court. And the idea was they had a worker, a government worker, that wasn't doing their job. It was apparent that they were skipping out in the middle of the day and basically just not coming back to work. And I imagine it's probably the same in all of your governments, but I hope it's not. But in general, it's relatively hard to fire people, even when they're not performing. Not actually just in government, man, even in the corporate world these days, it seems to be that way. But anyway, the thing with the government is they actually had an investigative team. They actually called the IG, the Inspector General. They got some of their agents and said, hey, can you actually watch this guy and tell us where he's going? We'd like to document this so we can fire him, so we can put someone in this place that's actually doing real work. And what they did is they actually attached a GPS unit to his car. And that was kind of the crux that went to court, is they didn't get a warrant for it. So they said since his car was out in the open, we can attach a GPS unit to it, a little transponder, and we'll just watch it. Instead of hiring tens of people to actually follow him, we can just let the actual device do it itself. And so that was the controversy here. But what I was thinking about is, man, let's say that we didn't go that route. Let's say the person actually had a Windows 7 laptop. And let's say when they brought it back to work one day, we just had the security team grab it and take the logs, the WLAN autoconfig logs. Imagine if we could go to those logs and start to look and say, this is interesting. It looks like Chad showed up to work today at about 10 because he first kind of logs on to the current wireless network in our building. And then at 12 every day, we see that same person log on to a network that's obviously kind of a home network. Maybe it's even named home or something like that. And maybe we could send a card by their house and see what wireless access points we can actually associate with. And if we can prove that access point is around said person's house, well, now we know every day at a certain time they go back and sit at their pool and surf the internet. Now we didn't have to do the GPS, the kind of the controversial kind of thing. We could actually pull it right out of the logs on the system itself. And that's when if you haven't figured out, I geek out on this stuff. That's when I start thinking, wow, this is awesome. It's only getting better. I mean, we're still looking at things like Windows 8. We're currently digging deep now to kind of update some of our classes. And Windows 8 is not disappointing. It is going to have even more artifacts than actually Windows 7 did. So we've talked about these MAC addresses. Who cares about the MAC address, right? I mean, if I know where the access point is and I can pull the MAC address off, well, I kind of know where everything is. But hold that thought for a moment. One thing I always like to recommend, I don't know how many law enforcement folks we have out there, but I really recommend that if you're out there and you are doing these type of cases, it's not a bad idea to also seize the access point. If you're going in and taking computers out of a home or something like that, get your warrant written up in a way that you can actually get the access point as well. The reason why is we've already seen in the registry that access point showing up. So at a minimum, you can start to narrow down and say, maybe you don't care about the home connections. Well, you can say, oh, this was obviously that home connection, something like that. And almost inevitably, that MAC address will actually be on the bottom of the access point. So if you don't want to seize it, take a picture of it, write it down in your investigator's notes, whatever that is. But the idea is that you can either use it to prove that that device was connected to the network at a certain time, or eliminate those results if you care about that device being someplace else. So once I have that MAC address, if I have access to one of the many databases out there around the world, I might be able to use just the MAC address to get pretty much some of the most accurate geolocation information available today. Those of you that, unless you've been living under a rock, it should not be shocking to you that you have all these companies that are basically war driving the world. Yeah. I mean, who would have thought back in the day that actually war driving would be a commercial pursuit? You know, it used to be all these just hackers were going out with these kind of wireless rigs and kind of war driving, looking for open access points and things like that. But when you've got these organizations like Skyhook, which used to be the primary provider for Apple products, until Apple took it in-house. Of course, everybody's familiar with Google Street View. So when these devices are going around and, say, mapping streets and taking video or still images of actually the locations, they're also taking kind of readings. So they're taking GPS coordinates of where they are. That's how they're matching up the photos. And they're also actually watching or recording all of the wireless access points they're in range of. Now, Google got in a little trouble for this because they were doing a little bit even more than that. If you remember, the EU kind of stomped on them pretty hard because they were collecting not just the access points, but they were actually associating with the access points and starting to record data for whatever reason. But regardless of that, they have these tremendous databases that have MAC address, SSID, and GPS coordinates all together. If you have access to one of these databases, you can bump up that MAC address from the registry and pretty much tell, probably within a 10-meter range of where that access point is sitting. And in some cases, this is actually more accurate than just GPS artifacts. Turns out, particularly in things like urban environments, GPS doesn't do great in really big cities, for instance. Big buildings tend to kind of block its accuracy or block it altogether. Also, it doesn't do very well inside. Those of you that have shiny new GPSs, you're trying to get them to associate indoors, a lot of times you have to walk outside just to get your satellites kind of synced up. So what happens is that there's actually 3 different kind of ideas all triangulating where this is, and those databases are recording all of them. So by using cell tower triangulation, which is sometimes accurate, sometimes not, Wi-Fi positioning can actually be more accurate in urban areas than GPS, and then of course GPS, if it exists, is pretty darn accurate itself. By taking all those together, all of a sudden, man, we've got a very interesting and accurate way to kind of triangulate. And those databases often have all of that information. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're wondering when I'm going to give you the link to Skyhook or Google's database. Unfortunately, as far as I know, the commercial vendors haven't largely opened those up. I keep waiting for there to be like some kind of service that you can kind of subscribe to or something like that. But I haven't. I'm not aware of any. I don't know if any of you are. I'd love to hear about it if you run into anything like that. But once in a while, you'll see like a hack for Skyhook, for instance, where someone kind of figures out a way around their API protections and is able to bounce things off their database. But usually that's plugged pretty quickly. That being said, there is a free version of those databases out there, and it's sitting here looking at you right now. It's called wiggle.net. It has, I think, over 13 million wireless networks dumped in. Largely, this is the repository of all of those amateur war drivers. So once you get your war driving output, you can dump it into this database, and everyone can kind of take advantage of it. And you've got to see the density. This is New York, Manhattan, that we're looking at. The density can be quite good in a lot of cities. I've done this talk, kind of I did it at the Department of Defense Cybercrime Conference, I guess last year, and I actually did a live demo where I grabbed the SSID and the MAC address of the access point I was on, and actually bounced that up against the database, and it showed us the exact hotel, actually the exact corner of the hotel we were actually on. So in some cases, it's not nearly as comprehensive as the Google and Skyhook databases, but it's worth a look. It's free, which is always a nice thing. Now, Harlan Carvey actually wrote a tool to kind of facilitate searching this. So it's just a quick little Perl script, and you can see it's a pretty neat little thing. You can give it a full list of MAC addresses. So if you pulled out all the MAC addresses from the registry, you can bounce them all up against the same time. You can put the output in just text format, or you can actually even output it as a Google Maps URL or a KML file for Google Earth. So it's a neat little thing. The only thing you need is a username and password from Wiggle, which, as I've said before, is actually free. So if you're interested in this, you can download it kind of down here, out on the Google code page. And give Harlan Carby a big high five for providing that to the community. So this is kind of what I was talking about, where probably when I first started talking about geolocation of IP addresses, you wanted to kind of turn off. You're like, maybe I should go watch the America's Cup. I'm not going to learn anything new here. But that was actually just the starting point, and it's not a bad option. But let's watch how we can triangulate using kind of all of these artifacts. So imagine that I'm looking at the computer for the first time. I pull out an IP address. So I take that IP address right here, and I triangulate that using kind of MaxMind or one of the standard kind of geolocation databases out there. It's going to get me to San Jose, California. So at least I know now my person was in San Jose, if that matters to me. Then I go to my Network Location Awareness registry key. And I noticed that this network, at the time that IP address was actually assigned, actually also happened to be on a network called sj.cisco.com. So what we're looking kind of here, this is the Cisco campus in San Jose. So now I'm a little bit closer than I was before. So it's not just San Jose, now it's a specific campus within San Jose. Then I go into the actual wireless serial configuration of the WLAN. I see it was connected to a specific SSID called Cisco Public. Turns out the Cisco Public is actually in this building right here. And you can find that through something like the Wiggle database. And of course, we can get even closer by plugging that MAC address into the Wiggle database. And now it gets us not only to the building, but let's just say for fun that it actually gets us to an exact corner of the building. It's very, very close. Now we're talking within hundreds of feet of where that device was at a very specific date and time. And with some of those historical records, like we saw in Windows 7, we can actually watch the person kind of as they start to associate with maybe other devices. Maybe they're walking around the campus. And we can actually kind of figure out where they are based upon that. So very, very cool stuff. And really comes together by chaining all of these different artifacts together. How's everybody doing? Having fun? Hopefully you're still alive. The only thing about webcasts is I'm always concerned that I'm actually talking to myself. One of these days I'm gonna go back to the video and realize that the mic was off the entire time. How sad would that be, actually? Anyway, thanks for the feedback there, guys. I appreciate it, and gals. Okay, so let's dig deeper. So now instead of just dealing with stuff kind of in the registry, let's talk about some of the other artifacts we can pull out. And one of our best friends in this area is going to be something called HTML5. So HTML5 is largely rolled out. Any browser on any modern system now will have HTML5 capabilities. And this provides a tremendous amount of new capabilities to the browser, including the ability to actually geolocate the device itself. As such, we should expect that we'll be able to pull out those artifacts from things like the browser history or browser cache in order to pull them out for our own use. So as I said, virtually every major browser now, going back to even things like Firefox 3.5, actually has support now for geolocation. And keep in mind, I've been talking a lot about laptops, but much of what we're talking about can also kind of transition over to things like other mobile devices like smartphones that also have browsers, that also potentially have the ability to cache kind of some of this other information. So here's how it works with HTML5. So imagine that I go to a site. Okay, so I'm on my browser. I go out to a site that wants to geolocate me. Should I give it permission? Or let's say, should I have given it permission at one time in the past and that option has been saved? It will then call the Start Watching function. That Start Watching function is built directly into HTML5. One of the amazing thing is you can take an existing site and make it geo-aware with just a handful of lines of code. It is dead simple to actually transition your site to a geolocation or geo-aware site, which means we should expect to see a lot more of these. as we go through. But once that function kicks off, it's going to go to things like the wireless access points and range. It'll do IP geolocation if necessary. It will take things like the signal strength of those wireless access points. And if you have a broadband card, it can even go out and do cell tower triangulation. It packages all that information up, sends it up to a service like Google. I believe Firefox by default uses Google Latitude, or at least it used to. Google Latitude, I think, has been phased out as of earlier this year. But whatever service it uses, it will pass it through. It'll be bounced up against one of those databases that we've been talking about. And within the DOM of your browser, it will have a couple of parameters set to be your latitude and longitude. Now those will be available to the application that you approved. So it could be Yelp or Twitter or Google Maps or whatever application you might be running into. So that's nice, but what does it mean for us? We're probably not going to get access to the DOM necessarily on a running system or on a host-based system. Maybe if it was running, we could do some checks. We're also probably not going to be able to pull this across a packet capture or something like that. Certainly if you had a packet capture, you could give it a shot. By default, it does use SSL, so you have to do some sort of SSL kind of man-in-the-middle attack in order to get access to that. But let's say you did, and what I really want to show here is just what it kind of looks like. It's very, very simple kind of request and response kind of going on here. So we see that request going out to Google. So it looks like it found 2 access points with specific MAC addresses and SSIDs and signal strength. So again, that database is going to have the GPS coordinates tied to those SSIDs and MAC addresses. The signal strength will allow it to do some triangulation of maybe where exactly that is. So that information gets sent to, let's say, Google. Google comes back with a response. And actually this response was so accurate, I had to actually kind of remove some of the information. It actually got like 1 house down from mine, which was pretty amazing. So the reason why this matters is, think about this from a host-based forensics standpoint. These packets were created in memory, and they were sent over your network adapter. Then they were brought back, and all this is kind of being monitored also by your browser. So there is a decent chance that you can find things like these JSON responses sitting out. Even if you can't find them in allocated spaces, you're going to find all kinds of them out in free space. So you may be able to link some of those up and be able to tell that, say, this device was once at the exact location where the murder occurred or where some other type of bad activity might have happened. So we want to keep our eye out for things that look kind of like these kind of requests or responses. So when I was digging into this, I actually came across a pretty interesting best practice. So this idea that, a lot of us when we're doing browser forensics, we tend to focus on history. History gives the biggest bang for our buck in browser forensics. It's where someone has likely been. For instance, for this example, I went up to a site called milegecharts.com, and what it does is it allows you to put your location that you started at and the location you ended at, and it will tell you what the mileage was. Not by the roads, not by as the crow flies. So if you had an expense report or something like that, you could actually tell what your exact mileage was to turn in for that expense report. But if all I was doing was looking at the history, I'd have really no idea of what was really happening behind the scenes. Because all I get is one entry, milegecharts.com. And milegecharts comes up, it says, can I use your current location? And that way I don't have to type where I'm coming from, I just have to tell them where I went, right? Look at what came out of the actual connections. And by default, what I'm actually going to see in the actual cache. So this is this idea of the dynamic web. Often a visit to one site can give 20 to 30 actually entries within the cache of all the other sites going out to actually build that dynamic page that provides the results. And many times, especially when we're dealing with mapping, that dynamic content is going to be through something like Google Maps or Bing Maps or one of these mapping software. Knowing that, I can go look for things like maps.google.com entries in my cache. And if I get lucky, I might just find things like the actual coordinates that they actually came from. So looking at the cache can really give really big breakthroughs in this case. So here's an example, kind of looking at the cache, we see a maps.google.com. A lot of times I'll just sort my cache by maps.google.com and poke around. And you see here this LL is actually going to provide us the longitude and latitude for what was geolocated at this time. So we can see mileagecharts.com being accessed, and within seconds of that site being visited, all of a sudden I see a Google Maps entry pop up. And it happens to be geolocated or a map being created around a very specific set of coordinates. So now I have a pretty decent idea that at that date and time, that service, mileagecharts.com, geolocated to this actual location in order to display that map. And this is becoming very frequent. As I said, it's relatively trivial for sites to add this kind of functionality in. I mean, imagine your chain restaurants. So I don't want to go to a chain restaurant website and actually see all their locations. What I prefer to do is see the location that's closest to me. So in many cases, the browser will say, hey, can I use your current location? I say, of course, please. Show me the nearest McDonald's or show me the nearest site or restaurant that I want to go to. And when that happens, more often than not, these actually entries get thrown out in your cache, and you can geolocate where that device was. Because, of course, we have a date and time for each entry within the cache. Same with things like Street View. You'll notice we get a little different parameter here. With Street View, we actually get a CVLL instead of an LL. In this case, does anyone recognize kind of where we're actually looking at here with Street View from this example? Probably those of you that have flown over from basically any place in Asia, there's a decent chance you've come through this airport. This is actually LAX in Los Angeles. This is the crazy restaurant that sits at LAX. So I could determine that by taking this Latin long here and actually geolocating that. So here's a little cheat sheet for you if you ever run across some of these. So there's a bunch of different parameters you might run into. Some are not very useful, like amazingly the one named lat long doesn't really give us the information we might expect. But you'll see things in here for like being able to tell the source and destination address that was plugged in to get directions. So when someone is trying to get directions from someplace, there's a pretty decent chance they're probably at that place, right? If I want to know how to get to a certain restaurant, I'm probably at the place that I tell it I'm trying to get directions from, or at least nearby there. Or sometimes you get things like not the exact coordinates, but actually the map, the actual map parameters or the map boundaries. So it might be for like a neighborhood. So let's say there's a bunch of burglaries in a neighborhood and you have the suspect's computer. Well, the fact that actually you've been looking at map tiles around where those kind of burglaries have occurred could be a pretty interesting artifact that you could use. So lots of different ways to kind of investigate kind of these. And this is just Google API. Of course, you got to look at things like Bing API and things like that, which I don't think too many people have done that deep into yet. But certainly the idea is still there because it's not just Google Maps where you can get this information. Once you start poking around, you'll be surprised at how often you're stumbling upon these. For instance, Flickr. So Flickr has an option for nearby, which is actually kind of neat. If you're ever traveling someplace and you want to actually see some pictures, maybe you're trying to figure out where to go next, or you just want to get an idea of where you're at, you can hit the nearby and it'll show you pictures taken by people around the area where you're standing. So I did that. I was down in Salt Lake City, and you can see I got an entry here for Flickr.com nearby, a very specific set of coordinates. And of course, I was very, very close to that location when I went to the nearby. And notice this is the mobile version of Flickr. So this is an idea of this would not only be in a laptop, but this could also be kind of in a smartphone or a mobile device. One of the nice things about this is it literally will not allow you to go to that page. It won't show you anything unless you actually allow it to geolocate. So when you see flickr.com/nearby, it's a guarantee that someone actually geolocated. And what you'll see beyond that is actually the coordinates. You can even see things like the corresponding Google Maps. That Google Maps entry right here actually corresponds to the map that was drawn on the website. So we actually get two different possible artifacts that we can take advantage of here. And then we can dig even deeper. So things like Twitter. I love this. So I love how it says not only walks you through kind of adding location, but it also tells you please click remember for this site. That way you'll always, for every tweet past this point, it will nicely grab your geolocation information and plug it in with Twitter. I don't even need the device then, right? I can actually just grab your Twitter feed if it's public and start to geolocate with some degree of accuracy with a very specific date and time, right? But let's say based on the host piece, where you're going to see this information turns out is actually in another JSON type file, like we saw with Google Maps. So this is a very, very common format that you should be paying attention to when trying to grab geo information. So beyond the JSON, actually Twitter keeps a cookie, funnily enough. In that cookie, it keeps a timestamp and the actual IP address of the system. So this is yet another place where we can actually find the IP address of the system at a specific date and time. So going all the way back to kind of the earlier part of this presentation, this is another place where we can get that. And of course, I can do some geolocation on this as well. In my experience, this is pretty much what Twitter appears to be using when it geolocates tweets. So tweets are going to be, in some cases, not incredibly accurate, since they really tend to be using just geolocation of IPs, it seems. So just if you're ever looking for this stuff, here's some of the URLs you might pay attention to. Again, you'll kind of pay attention to things like JSON, but in some cases you get really lucky. IP equals, or lat equals, or long equals. So you can get an idea of kind of some search terms you could use in order to look for things. Or even you'll see, not just in Twitter, but in a lot of other mobile apps, you'll see parameters like place, where it'll actually show you kind of the restaurant that was geolocated to, or things like that. So you might be able to look for those. And you can sometimes geolocate not to actually a specific set of coordinates, but Twitter will sometimes say you're nearby the White House, or you're nearby the specific landmark. And so that would be an indication of a general location that device was. But here's some of those terms I've used pretty effectively. These coordinates actually go back to that Google JSON that we saw previously. But kind of knowing what these look like, throwing up something like a web proxy or something like that, and actually watching as things get geolocated can help you kind of craft the right search terms to find them. Just some more examples. This is an example of another JSON fragment that not only has coordinates but also location. Now, if you're pulling JSON out, if anyone's ever heard of bulk extractor, it's a pretty neat tool out there. It does an amazing job. It has a scanner that specifically will pull out JSON content. It does a really good job of pulling this kind of piece out. I'll throw a link to it up in the chat room if you want to check it out. And of course, kind of wrapping things up a little bit, I really love this because we get all this technical stuff where we're digging into carving out JSON fragments out of memory and then matching the parameters what they really mean to kind of a Google type of geolocation. But then you come across a hit like this. And it just turns out that a lot of URLs have some very interesting parameters. This is actually from a Hilton hotel in the US, and we can see just kind of parsing out the URL. I can figure out with a Hilton, I can figure out the actual zip code, so I know the actual city and state it's sitting in. I have the IP address for geolocation, all the way down to a MAC address for actual things like geolocation, maybe off a Weagle database or something. So in some cases, we just get really lucky. All right, well, that kind of finishes things up, right on time actually. So I will open it up for questions here. And in general, I did want to tell you guys before you all take off that I'm actually one of the co-authors of the SANS 508 class, and this has been basically completely rewritten to really look at kind of more advanced adversaries and look at some of these more advanced artifacts. Particularly around computer intrusion cases, but also just around people using privacy cleaners and really trying to cover their tracks a bit. And it turns out we've got a couple of upcoming events happening in Asia towards the end of the year. So Singapore, Korea, and Sydney. So if you're around, I'd love to see you there. Otherwise, let me take some questions for you. Allison, absolutely. I actually didn't mention ISF but I did put it on the very beginning of the slide. I want to thank you guys for sponsoring this and getting the word out the Australian Information Security Association, correct? I got to do a neat presentation with you guys last year, I mean, probably around this time, actually. What we need to do is I need to get over there in person, so we need to figure out how to make that work out sometime. But absolutely, it's great to partner up with you, and it's great to see so many people. I'm actually kind of looking at the names and recognizing some friends I've met before, so it's good to see you out there as well. Did I bore you all to death, or any questions, or how about any war stories? Anybody been lucky and found some really neat geolocation artifacts that I either did or did not cover that kind of helped you out? I think it's probably lunchtime. Everyone's very quickly turning off the location aware settings in their phone and trying to figure out where to go to lunch. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go back a couple slides just for a minute, or just for this one. Here's my contact information. Definitely look me up if you have any questions or want to share anything. I always love, the things I love about teaching is I always learn something from the folks that I get to spend time with. So I would love to hear about other things you found, if you have anything you can share, because this is actually one of my real passions. I think it's fascinating, the fact that we can take a device and put it someplace on the Earth with a very high degree of accuracy, with just a couple of artifacts. So please stay in touch. You can follow me on Twitter and take a look at the SANS website. If we're starting to really try to make a bigger push in Asia Pacific, and we'd love to get some momentum going out there. All right. Well, with that, I will hand it back to Ruby. I'll stick around and chat for a short while longer. Did I miss anything? All right, well, thanks so much. Oh, one question above. Hold on. What did I see? Which one did I miss? Oh, it says, Carolyn said, do you think the exit tool you mentioned is more effective than OrphanView? To be honest, I haven't benchmarked the two together, but I'll tell you what, I've never really been disappointed with exit tool. The data pulled out of exit tool usually beats other commercial forensic tools I've compared it against. So while OrphanView I know is very popular, and to be honest, the exit tool is excellent. And since OrphanView is highly kind of image related, I would expect it probably pretty similar, where exit tool might have more advantages on all the other different formats. It probably supports over 120 different formats, so I'm guessing it probably beats OrphanView at that point. But the best thing to do is get a few sample images and test them both out, and get comfortable with whatever your tool of choice is. Okay, well, I'll be signing off. Find the bad guys, and stay in touch. Take care. Thanks for spending the hour with me.